problem. And see, that was the kind of like underlying sink, wink, or metaphor. Yes, there's going to be difficulties with fire in your future, but don't sweat it. Everything will be cool. Because after the fire, turns out the house was gutted and totally flamed out, and so the insurance company paid the property off. And George hadn't even moved in yet, and all of a sudden it's debt-free. And then he and his brother-in-law scrounged up some dollars and some material and rebuilt the place. So now that's a very large sink wink. My little sink wink with the spaghetti is probably much more common to what's going to occur. But the more you pay attention to these, the more you're aware that universe is actually talking to you. And it's a real good exercise to put it into consciousness and carry around these little journals and say, aha, and note the date and time and what actually happened.
That's very true, and it can be in minute detail, like you said, if you're really paying attention.
Yeah.
And it's not because nothing happens by coincidence or by accident.
Yeah, if you want to make a Buddhist laugh, go and give him the one word joke. Just go up to him and say coincidence. I've done it and it works. And it's kind of like George and I have a little private joke going, which won't be so private now, but anytime he knows I'm really down or whatever, he'll call me up and say, hey, normally. Because there just is none of that anymore.
That is great. Well, Universe spoke to both of you because of meeting, and you just have a really cool friendship.
Oh, we're not alone or anything. Yeah, in that regard. Yeah, but you're quite correct. The internet was the nexus for it and provides the connectivity there, and we're just part of our own little self-organizing collective. And I'm seeing them all over the place now, by the way, under various different kinds of names. Whole towns are starting to form these, so it's like, well, we were quite correct that meme would really start surfacing this year, and I expect to see a lot more of it by the end of 2009. Just as a matter of survival, especially here in the U.S. Times are going to get really tough. Part of our problem is that our data shows, this is one of the issues with George is he gets all whipped up and he calls me and says, oh, and it's like, Clif can't get excited about it because he lived this moment 6 months ago. And so I do have a tendency to get a little jaded, but I want to keep enough of the surprises of universe around. However, it looks as though the economic situation is going to can be broadly described as causing an issue with the power elite. And the power elite that we see from Obama on down are going to be faced with the fundamental problem of their path is currently attempting to prop up or sustain or resurrect, whichever way they want to view it, a system which is basically defunct. And until we actually get to the point where we admit it, we're like alcoholics and we're still trying to drink from that same punch bowl. None of that's going to be effective through this year. No matter how much they try and spend on infrastructure, no matter how much debt they try and create, you don't solve a debt problem with more debt. And we don't have any assets to sell. We don't have any ability to raise actual physical wealth in the form of calories anymore. We're at a very interesting point in our relationship as a species with our planet where we're consuming very near to the absolute edge of what we can in the biota on an annual basis. So we're going to have the whole thing, predicted famines, all kinds of strange weather which we know about, which is going to induce even further complications in food deliveries. We're going to have energy resource problems and the collapse of the dollar. And perhaps, as our data indicates, we're going to see a level of repudiation of the infrastructure debt by our actual government. Hopefully, they can do it in an orderly fashion and are simply not compelled to do it sometime this summer. So I don't know. Time may be mutable. And if we could go and talk to the government and say, okay, you idiots, here's your real situation. Somebody's got to fess up, go on TV and say, this is the way it really is, guys. We got to get straight about it and start actually speaking the truth about what's going to happen here and do these horrible, terrible things which will induce much suffering. But we either induce it or the universe does. I don't see the politicians doing that, but basically that's really our only out at this stage.
Yeah, when you say the government itself will repudiate, what facet of the government?
The whole thing. See, here's the conundrum. It takes $2 billion a day, absolute bare minimum, of foreign purchases of our debt to sustain our lifestyle here in the U.S. The lifestyle basically supports the government. The government is in the curious situation of not depending on taxes to survive. The way I have it figured, and I could be wrong in terms of the absolute number, but that seems to be somewhat immaterial. The general principle is that the amount of taxes they collect is but a small fraction of what they're actually spending. They're spending future debt. That debt is propped up by foreigners who are willing to take our green pieces of paper for actual goods like oil and cheap stuff from China. This is going to stop. All of the other countries have told basically each other and themselves that they're no longer going to deal in dollars. China has announced it's going to start settling all of its own international debts in yuan, which means if we wanted to buy something from China, we would have to sell our dollars for yuan, and that's going to cause us a conundrum when all of a sudden it takes $80 to buy a yuan because everybody knows our dollar is worthless. At that point, which we think will be maybe May or June, we're going to get to the situation where basically our government is bankrupt because all it can produce is phony money that no one wants. Our government in the United States has done this to the populace for previous times. They did it with the Continentals. They did it with the Confederate debt. They did it with the private banking debt in the 1890s. And then there was one other, which was the greenback dollar, which was a federal experiment that was short-lived. So they're about to do it for a fifth time. And it comes down to some strange math that basically the dollar has debt associated with it. When it starts out, it has the ability to absorb 100 cents worth of debt. Now we're at the last penny. And so it can't absorb any more debt. The more debt they create, hyperinflation ensues, and then no one takes dollars at all, and we have an Argentinian-style collapse of our financial system. At this point, the rest of the planet, those countries that are aware of what's going on, are attempting desperately to insulate themselves from what they know is inevitable, and they're hoping that will be delayed until summer. That sort of makes sense?
Why hoping it will be delayed? To have time to prepare in what way?
Correct. The other countries are afraid that the United States, which is a global empire, when its currency crashes and it can't even afford to get its troops back home because it can't afford to buy oil for its boats and will probably end up having to send the nuclear aircraft carriers to go and fetch people, might just react in a very negative fashion. And we have all kinds of nasty weapons. And so right at the moment we have the history of Bush trying to impose the dollar on Iraq by destroying Iraq. And yet, we're in a situation where no amount of military force anymore, that was a failed experiment, by the way. We didn't get oil out of Iraq. We weren't able to maintain the prestige of the dollar. All we did was demonstrate how stretched, thin, and ineffective our military is. We don't win wars. All we know how to do is bomb people. We don't know how to win a war. And we haven't for a number of years. I think even arguably since the World War II. In any event, though, all of that aside, the isolation of the United States will be necessary in order to sort of keep the rest of the planet together. Because they've got to evolve some other thing other than the U.S. dollar as trade amongst themselves. And basically, this isolates us in a particular time where we're going to go through some real hardships. Mm-hmm. You know, and the repudiation by the federal government may mean the point where they issue you a Social Security check, sure. Might take 3 months to get there, and when it gets there, it might be enough to buy a cup of coffee. I mean, they just, in Zimbabwe, started printing $50 billion notes, I understand.
$50 billion notes?
Yeah. And we're going to get to hyperinflation. I think it'll be extremely short-lived based on our data, but we're going to get to a hyperinflation here in the U.S. There's absolutely no doubt. It's 100% created in the situation that with all of the bailouts and their next, quote, stimulus package, because all they're doing is attempting to shove more debt into the system to see if they can't prop it up. Roosevelt did this in the 30s, and it proved to be non-effective. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, the rest of us have to actually get together in small groups and start creating the economy that will rebuild itself from the ashes of the former American empire.
That's really good, because we're going to take a break now, and then when we come back, we'd like to hear more detail from you how you see that happening, because we have had a lot of programs about storing food, growing your own food, you know, having the skills of being sovereign and so forth. So
sounds good.
We'll go there when we come back with Clif from halfpasthuman.com on Beyond the Ordinary right after this.
Back with Clif, Adventures in Future Viewing. Okay.
So if we lose the dollars by this summer?
It's problematic to use that term explicitly, because here's the problem. the dollar could be repudiated, and our term has been rejected by all. We started seeing that in 2003, I believe. I'll check with George. But about 2003, so a number of years ago, we started seeing the term rejected by all reference to the dollar outside of the U.S. Of course, just because the rest of the world rejects the dollar, we may decide internally that we'll continue to use it for a while. Then there actually may be some logic in that, because at this point, 98% perhaps, or some absolutely economic level of term of our dollars are digital. So when they're rejected, they just go poof, leaving us with a much smaller pool of actual physical dollars, which may, to a certain extent, raise within the United States the value of that actual piece of paper for a while. I don't know how long that'll last, and if that's juxtaposed with hyperinflation, it may be moot. The sudden appreciation of an actual physical dollar, because when you think about it, how often do you go out and about anymore and actually see people trading pieces of paper back and forth? Usually it's a swipe of a card, and I'm guilty of that myself. It's convenient, it works, provides me with tracking, etc. So we're going to be faced with a situation, though, where there won't be anything behind the dollar, not that there is now, other than the illusion of the good faith and credit of the United States government. Once that illusion parts, it'll happen extremely rapidly. Losses of confidence in today's world will spread at the speed of electronics, so it'll go around the whole world 7 times before anybody's had breakfast, that sort of a deal. And it'll just be a repudiation of the confidence in the dollar. Now, for various different reasons, we may, as I say, continue to use paper greenbacks here in the United States for some period of time, but the impact is going to be quite severe. For instance, we may have hyperinflation, and as I say, Social Security payments, etc., may not be worth the paper they're printed on, even when cashed. We're going to have impacts on all of our systems that are oil-dependent, food production, etc., etc. So those kind of impacts will be actually multi-generational. And, oh, lucky for us, we're the first generation. So, what we're doing here is we refer to them as SOCs, self-organizing collectives. And it was just a fun term to use, you know. You got to know where your socks are. It's a rough universe out there. But the concept is really cool. And basically what it is you have to separate yourself as a human being, a sovereign individual, from the systems around you. And in doing so, you discover that, well, you really are sovereign. You can do all kinds of things that don't require messing about with dollars or participating in a dying American empire in a dollar system. And if you get together a bunch of people that do this, why, all of a sudden you have a guerrilla gardening movement that sweeps the whole nation or the whole continent. And with the Internet, as long as it continues to stay up, you have the ability to internetwork for ideas, and ideas are the real currency of the future. And that's really what we're getting to, is unfortunately, the power elite's going to attempt to prop up the decaying system that is dead, is just staggering around waiting for a nice place to arrive to where it can fall over.